As per tradition, every March we release our threat detection report. And because the threat detection report is quite large and expansive, we like to do a webinar to kind of walk through some of the themes from the report and discuss how things are interrelated. So this year's the 2025 Threat Detection Report. Confusingly, it examines all of the threats that we detected in 2024 calendar year. I am Brian Donahue. I'm a principal security researcher on the community team at Red Canary, which means that my focus is on the research that we decide to publish. Alex Banninger is a senior manager on our Intel team. Thanks for joining us, Alex. And then Jesse Griggs is a senior threat researcher on our research team. So he is more focused on conducting research that contributes to the development and the improvement of the Red Canary product. He also, both of these people partner with the community department extensively to create content that you may read on our blog, in the threat detection report, and elsewhere. And both, obviously, all three of us are some of the main contributors to this year's threat detection report, both as writers and reviewers of other things that got written. So what are we going to talk about today? I already did who we are. Next up, we're going to talk about what the threat detection report is. I'll try and make that brief, but I do like to explain it just in case there's any new folks here who've never read it before. Then we'll get into the actual content of the webinar. So we're going to start out with Stealers and initial access. Then we'll go from there to identities in the cloud. We'll be discussing how these things are interrelated. And then to close us out, time permitting, we're going to talk about ransomware because we still think this is a huge problem and a major risk to organization that folks are concerned about. We can do questions at the end. However, we also have the chat box here. So if you have any questions throughout, post them in the chat. I will be reviewing those throughout the webinar as other people are talking. I'll try and stop us when I see a question that's worth answering in real time, or we'll address them at the end of each section or maybe the end of the webinar altogether. So the threat detection report. What is the threat detection report? So big picture, it's this big aggregate macro analysis of all the threats that we investigated for our customers in a calendar year. So, right, 2025 threat detection report. So we're actually talking about 2024 data. And we emphasize this on higher severity threats. So to give you a quick snapshot, we're protecting basically 4 million things. These are endpoints, they're identities, they're cloud assets, SaaS applications. And like from all of these tools that we're using to protect these things, we ingest about 308 petabytes of security telemetry annually. So just under a terabyte, or just under, sorry, a petabyte of that telemetry every day. And across the entire year, we generated 30 million potentially malicious events. So to unpack that a little bit, we have a library of detection analytics. We also do alert validation and investigation across a variety of different tools. So these potentially malicious events might be a detection analytic that, some of the telemetry came in, matched that detection analytic. It creates an event and it gets investigated either by a human on our detection engineering team, some sort of machine learning tool, maybe AI agents. And then at the back end of that, we ended up detecting 93,000 threats. Now, to be clear, these 93,000 threats are human confirmed threats. So we aren't just counting alerts here. It's things that we decided were a threat, and then that was then confirmed by our customers. So we subtract false positives from this count. We also subtract testing when we know it's testing. Customers can confirm that for us. And we try to focus on only the high and medium severity threats, mostly for this report. So that 93,000, about 25,000 of those are those high severity and medium severity threats. And that's predominantly what we're focusing on in the threat detection report data. The report itself is structured into 3 sections. We've got a trend section. That's our highest level section. This allows us to sort of look out beyond our data, although the data does drive the trends we decide to talk about. But it also allows us to look around the industry and talk about things that we may or may not be seeing. The next step down from that are threats. So when we send a confirmed threat detection to a customer, it may be associated with a named threat or a testing tool or an activity cluster or a threat group. And we associate those things whenever we can. That's a lot of the work that Alex Behringer's team does day in, day out, tracking those threats, associating them, building profiles for them, figuring out how to detect them. And then the most granular level is techniques. So any detection can be mapped to one or more MITRE attack techniques. And these three things kind of work together, right? You string enough techniques together, you get yourself a threat. String enough threats together, you might get yourself a trend. So here's everything in the report in this kind of overwhelming slide. Each and every one of these words / technique names, threats, trends, they each have their own section in the threat detection report that includes, analysis, explanation of why these things are a problem, and also detection guidance, testing guidance, what you need to collect to have visibility into these. So you guys can go and explore this on your own time. We're going to focus on just a small handful of these in today's webinar. And we're going to start with kind of a big picture, high level thesis here. And that is that there is this highly commoditized market for stealers. And these stealers are fueling identity compromises because one of the main things they go after is credential material, whether it's username password combos, API keys, cookies that you can use to get token access. And then on the back end of that, like once they use these to compromise an identity, these identity compromises are fueling kind of like almost everything else bad that happens in this industry. So let's get right into it. I'm going to hand it off here to Alex Behringer to talk about initial access and stealers.
All right, so let's start with some initial access tradecraft. This is one of the trends that are within the report. And of course, we're seeing a lot of the same things that we've been seeing for years now. First one, phishing. This continues to be a highly successful initial access vector. But one thing to note this year is that we saw a notable usage of adversaries combining multiple different methods of social engineering to be successful. So one of these examples is with Black Basta affiliates who were using email bombing campaigns combined with phone calls. And so they would spam a lot of email to an unsuspecting victim, and then they would later on call them via Teams or their phone and say, hey there, we can fix your spam problem and all of your inbox that's flooded with spam. And instead of fixing it, they download an RMM tool. Also seeing combined social engineering to get past MFA prompts so they can get those credential access and then do some kind of text messaging or otherwise MFA bypass to get through the MFA. Vulnerability exploitation is hugely popular to gain initial access. And one thing to note with vulnerabilities is we don't just see them for initial access, we see them throughout the attacker lifecycle. And some notable vulnerabilities include the Fortinet FortiClient EMS application vulnerability, that's CVE 2023-48788. And this enables adversaries to execute arbitrary commands with system level permissions. And once they're inside a network, they would often install RMM tools or other PowerShell backdoors. We also observed a lot of ConnectWise's Screen Connect vulnerabilities being abused. So that's CVE 2024-1709 and 1708. And one thing that's notable with these is that we saw them exploited within days of disclosure for both initial access and lateral movement. And these were typically followed by deployment of Cobalt Strike or other legitimate RMM tools or additional malware. Another thing to note here, which is connected, is VPN abuse, which isn't tied to any one specific vulnerability, but a huge part of a larger trend that we're observing where adversaries are going after those edge devices that are not covered by EDR. We also saw a lot of web delivery. One of the notable trends is fake browser updates. And this is something that we observed in SOC Ghoulish, which is our #1 threat, and Scarlet Goldfinch, our #3 threat. And these have continually increased in scope and frequency over the past couple of years. And so for both of these threats, they present visitors with a compromised website with a lure indicating that that visitor needs to update their browser or some other common software. And the unsuspecting user will download what they think is that update, but it's actually a malicious JavaScript payload that launches the attack. Next steps after this is typically reconnaissance, persistence, credential theft. And one thing that's notable is that we have noticed these threats leading to ransomware. And so most recently, Sockgolish has been linked to Ransom Hub, and previously Lockbit, Wasted Locker, and some others. Also seeing search engine optimization poisoning, where adversaries are putting those keywords in the body or title of a web page in an attempt to make their malicious website show up closer to the top of that Google search results, and malvertising, where there's fake ads on search engine pages. And these fake ads can be for a lot of really popular software like QuickBooks, Grammarly, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, where they're tricking users who think they're downloading that legitimate application. And of course, valid accounts. Credentials are really the preferred option for adversaries, where they can log in and move around and potentially look like a legitimate user. And this has really contributed to the rise in Stealer malware, which we'll get in a little bit later, and a trend that we're going to continue to dive into throughout this webinar. Next slide. So one thing to call out that's been a really popular initial access trend is paste and run. We started observing this in August, and it has been hugely successful. In fact, it's actually really propelled Luma C2, NetSupport, and Hijack Loader into our top 10 threats, as well as MSHTA into the number 9 spot for our techniques. So it's just widely popular. And essentially what happens here is users are presented with the typical verify you are a human prompt or I'm not a robot button. We've all been conditioned to try to get past that prompt as quickly as possible. And that's what the adversaries are exploiting, is users being conditioned to get past this prompt. And so clicking that button covertly copies an obfuscated PowerShell command to the clipboard and then presents the user with some verification steps. Once the user does all of those verification steps, they inadvertently run this command. And that command will leverage MSHTA to download and execute a malicious payload from a remote resource. So next slide. So here's a couple examples of what that could look like. Again, just trying to exploit what we've all been conditioned to do and verify you are a human. And we've seen this associated with a lot of payloads. I already mentioned the top 3, also StealC and CryptBot as well. Next slide. So just some options for detecting and responding to initial access. So starting with that paste and run, because this is exploiting what users are trained to do, user education can be really beneficial. You can also consider disallowing access to the run dialog, or even disabling the use of command.exe or PowerShell for standard users. I know this is super hard for a lot of organizations to even think about, but like I mentioned, this has been wildly successful. For fake updates, like Sockgolish and Scarlet Goldfinch update those GPO settings so that for users, so that the malicious JavaScripts open in Notepad rather than executing automatically. For VPN exploitation, disabling layer 2 east-west visibility to VPN clients can really restrict what the adversary is able to do. And of course, deploy EDR across all systems that allow it. These adversaries are going to have to will likely move off of the VPN. And at that point, it's really important that the EDR has visibility into that. And then full vulnerabilities, really prioritize internet-facing and CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog for patching. We consistently see adversaries exploiting years-old vulnerabilities that have patches available but have not been patched in the environment.
I got to say, Alex, the surprise of the year for me has been the success of these paste and run campaigns. I remember when we first started tracking them, and I thought to myself, there's no way this is going to stick. This is too many things, right? Like, people aren't going to copy and paste commands into the run dialog box. And I was proven utterly wrong. Like, not only has it persisted, but it's been something that's been adopted by numerous threat actors. And it just shows you the extent to which, like, the requirement of user interaction is not a hurdle that matters a whole heck of a lot. Like, people will do what they think they need to do to achieve the result that they need to achieve, which I think we'll get into here when we start talking about Mac OS stealers a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is very surprising, and particularly when you look at how many threats and even techniques that have been propelled to the top 10 for a campaign that started in August. All right, so now we're going to move into Stealers. So this is really just coming back to Brian's initial stage setting, where there's this overall trend in identity compromises, and these are really being fueled by Stealers. And so we've really moved from this point in time where adversaries are trying to hack in by dropping malware, because EDRs and MDRs have gotten really good at detecting this and blocking the execution of backdoors. And so now Stealers are looking for those username and password combinations, being able to sell those credentials to an adversary that can then log in and potentially look like a legitimate user in the system, in the environment. Next slide. So Stealers are this huge part of this initial access broker business. And these groups or individuals are simply just trying to drop Stealer malware, which is malware that is designed to extract username and password details or other sensitive files. And we have observed Stealers increasing in prevalence over time, which is shown by this graph. All right, next slide. So what do Stealers take? They're taking credentials from web browsers, like those Chromium-based browsers or Gecko-based browsers. They're taking history, cookies, credentials, cryptocurrency wallets. They can take files. There's a huge range of things that these these Stealers go after. Looking back on 2024, we do have our top 10 list just of Stealers, and these are those malware that are very specifically created for stealing. And number one, Luma C2, that made our top 10 overall. But a couple other ones to highlight here is Atomic Stealer and our number 6, Poseidon Stealer, are both Mac OS stealers. So that's really unique that they were so prevalent this year. Yellow Cockatoo is another one. Having a bird, you know that it's a red canary named activity cluster, but it's one that's really fell off to the later part of the year, and one that we think may have gone dormant. So who do Stealers target? They're really trying to go, of course, after those engineering and admin credentials. That's going to give them the most access. Some of them are going after the crypto consumers, trying to get those wallet credentials, being able to access funds directly. And of course, others. These can enable, any credential pair can enable a lot of follow-on activity, lateral movement, privilege escalation. So they're going to take what they can. Next slide. So just looking at the intrusion chain for Stealers. So first of all, execution, they're reaching out, grabbing that malware. For defense evasion, they're running these malicious processes without detection, or they're injecting into other processes, which can make them more difficult to identify. Once they do all of this, once they've executed, they are looking for those credentials. So they're prompting for passwords. They're starting to look in the browsers or look in other places for those credential access, and then preparing the password and username pairs for exfiltration in collection. Sometimes during the collection and staging phase, they are using really obvious file names like passwords or cookies or files that can be detected against or noticed. And of course, once you get to exfiltration, at this point, assume that your data has left the premises. Adversaries are often using messaging services or file sharing services to do the exfiltration. But of course, we want to be able to catch them when they're coming in and not when they're coming out and those credentials have left the building. Next slide. So just moving into some of the notable Stealers that we saw. Luma C2, we've talked about already. This was our most prevalent Stealer in 2024, and number 6 most prevalent threat for the year. And this is in large part because of that pace and run technique that I discussed earlier. Luma is a malware as a service stealer, so it's available for a monthly or a full access purchase. And this can be hugely beneficial to adversaries because it's a relatively low cost, but it provides all of those same benefits that you or I will get from a legitimate subscription software. So it's has that continuous development, customer support. It has a range of features. And some of the features that it has been continually adding is actually a loader component, as well as some more customizable Steeler configurations. So the loader component allows for the delivery of additional payloads via EXE, DLL, or PowerShell. And some of the things that we have observed that it delivers is Net Support Manager. One thing is that the Luma developers do require that distributors use cryptors. However, they're not specific about what cryptor they use. And so this can really vary, which makes behavioral detection really difficult. So there's just no one size all detection for Luma. Some of the ones that we have observed more frequently are PureCryptor or Cypher IT. Next slide. And Mac OS, I already mentioned that there were two Steelers on our top Steeler list. They didn't make our top 10 for the year, but they were hugely prevalent. We saw a 400% increase in Mac OS threats from 2023 to 2024. So that's really remarkable. The Steelers we saw, of course, Atomic Poseidon, the other ones, Banshu and Cuckoo Steelers were other ones that targeted Mac OS. And oftentimes these are downloaded under that guise for free or cracked software or through that malvertising. So for most of these, we observed adversaries leveraging Mac OS's native AppleScript to gather files and prompt users for passwords, which you can see a couple of examples on the slide there. So the words will differ, but they all kind of follow the same trend. And then they set to stage before extraction. AppleScript provides a really easy way to gather information quickly, and it obviates the need for the adversaries to learn programming language in Objective-C or Swift.
And one thing to note before you move on, like as we were saying before with the paste and run thing and user interaction in general, like these prompts look almost completely identical to what you would expect to find when you're just downloading software from the internet, right? Like even as a user who's very conscious of this stuff, it still looks a lot like a standard Apple system prompt that says like this application needs your password for whatever reason. And you just kind of have to take it on faith that it does need your password or it does need access to some other part of the macOS operating system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's exploiting what we are all accustomed and familiar with doing. One thing to really note here is that to do this, they were bypassing macOS Gatekeeper. And when macOS came out with Sequoia, Apple removed the Gatekeeper bypass, which was commonly used by these Steeler families. And we saw a huge reduction in the amount of Mac Steelers that we observed after the Sequoia launch. So 95% of our Steeler infections happened prior to September, and just 5% occurred after.
Yeah, I don't think we included an image, but you could literally just right click to bypass Gatekeeper. And so the system prompt would say right click and say open, and that would just do an end around on the Gatekeeper protections at that time.
Awesome. All right, so detecting and responding to Steelers. So Steelers are really opportunistic malware. So the same things that will help protect you against other opportunistic malware will help with Steelers. Provide safe software installation sources for users, configure ad blocking tools wherever possible, and then, of course, deploy that endpoint security controls for detection throughout your environment wherever you can. Luma C2, all of those same things apply, but for response, really think about deleting all the components and determining that extent of the data theft, reset any credentials, and, of course, monitor any financial accounts if you determine that to be part of the data theft. And then for Mac Steelers, consider utilizing Mac Monitor to monitor and ingest, process, and event data that other tools are skipping that can be really helpful for identifying the MAC stealers.
If you Google Red Canary Mac Monitor, it's a free Mac collection tool. You can find it on the internet. All right, now we're going to move on to identity in cloud. So we'll hand it over to Jesse to talk us through what we've been seeing.
Yeah. So let's go to the next slide. So generally, we've been seeing a steady increase in the amount of related attacks and events with regards to identity. This is twofold. One, it's because more and more companies are moving into the cloud and leveraging more cloud resources, SaaS resources, centralized identity, all of those good things that provide us with a lot of handy features. And adversaries recognize that, so they are moving to match where everyone else is moving to. By far and away, valid accounts is going to be the number one. And I'll talk more specifically on that later, but this will just continue to be the glue that holds organizations together when it comes to identities and resources, and therefore adversaries are going to be targeting that heavily. We still overwhelmingly have endpoint and some cloud attacks being the majority of the events and threats that we publish, but identity is quickly becoming one of the major factors of events and threats that we're going to be publishing. So next slide, please. So what do I mean when we're talking about identity threats? So the way that we view it at Red Canary is we have our primitive, which is the identity. This is going to be the user, could be a service, basically anything that is granted credentials to access resources. So when we're talking about valid accounts, that is going to be things like your AWS roles, your service principals and Entra ID, or your managed identities and Entra ID, and then your GCP cloud identity. So your valid accounts will be all across the different cloud resources. The identity is granted the authority to assume these roles to then access the cloud resources. So we're going to flow from this identity through the account to the actual resources that you're going to have. These identities can have access to different accounts. They can have access to shared accounts. And so it comes very difficult to be able to tie the actual behavior back to which identity was the one that is compromised. And like Brian talked about earlier, these stealers are targeting things like passwords, usernames and passwords, or they could be access tokens, generally anything that is going to grant the adversary access to the resources. And then the resources that we're looking at, the two that we're going to focus on today is going to be email, and then we're going to be focusing on cloud service hijacking. So those will be the ones that I'm going to be diving into a little bit later on in the presentation. So next slide, please. The typical path that we're looking at, we have the credential compromise. Sometimes we can see that, especially if it's on endpoint. Sometimes we can't. The stealers can, farm out these credentials and sell them on the back end. And so we don't actually know where they're coming from some of the time, but these credentials are going to be compromised in some fashion. Then the account is going to be accessed. So this can be through cloud consoles, whether they're actually logging onto the portal through the GUI, or they're going to be accessing it through APIs or SDKs. So APIs, PowerShell modules to access Azure environments, this AWS CLI to access AWS, SDKs like the Python SDK for AWS, basically anything that the adversary can use to access the cloud, they're going to use it. It can be a mixture of both, so it becomes pretty challenging to figure out how they're accessing these, environments, whether or not that's through interactive or non-interactive sign-ins. Once they gain access to the environments, then reconnaissance as usual. So in AWS, something like Get Caller Identity, basically anything that is going to give them contextual awareness of what their permissions are and what their target is and where their target might reside. And then the real fun part about all these identity compromises is the account manipulation. This is generally where a lot of things are happening. So they could be accessing different roles. They could be pivoting from their current account to a different account. They could be creating new policies. We've seen that a lot, especially with service hijacking. If they don't have the access in their current account, then what they might do is try and grant themselves new access by adding a new policy to their account. Or they could be adding new credentials. If they're looking for more of that persistence activity, then they might be adding in a new identity provider at the top level of the organization. or they could be adding new credentials directly into the account and trying to bypass some of the management that could be going on there already. Basically, anything can be happening when it comes to this account manipulation thing. And this is where you might have similar patterns and similar trends in activity, but the actual minutia could be very different, specifically in this step. And then finally, with impact, this is going to be where they're trying to gain, financial means, crypto mining, business email compromise, service hijacking. This is really where the actual activity resides. So we want to detect things well before this happens. Obviously, we detect all through this chain, the impact being the last thing, generally the easiest to find, but we want to be pushing that detection space further and further left, which is what we're constantly trying to do. So next slide, please. So the three techniques that we're going to highlight: valid accounts, because it's our number one. This is, like I said, this is adversaries compromising the identities to then leverage account access to gain access to the resources. Valid accounts is not necessarily something that you're going to be able to detect. We hear a lot of, how do I write detections for valid accounts? It isn't really going to happen. I mean, you're going to be detecting the things that are happening through that account access, but you're not necessarily detecting that specific account compromise. You can obviously do things with IOCs, looking at anomalous behavior, which can be very challenging, but something that we're always striving to get better at, and we're pushing more towards that as part of our identity offerings. And then we're looking at email and forwarding and hiding rules. This is going to be where business email compromise happens. So this is all adversaries looking for either financial gains or data theft, depending on what their objectives are. And then finally, service hijacking. This was not one of the top threats that we've seen in terms of volume, but there have been an increase view towards generative AI SaaS offerings. So things like AWS Bedrock. Adversaries are looking to compromise these services to then sell access on the back end for financial gain. So that's something that we wanted to highlight here because it's something that picked up pretty significantly in the end of the year and is also pretty unique. So next slide, please. So valid accounts. The scroll of truth here is this will always be number one until we stop leaving unsecured credentials everywhere. It is far too easy for adversaries at the moment to gain access to these credentials. If they install a stealer, typically it's going to be accessible right on the endpoint. Sometimes they don't even have to install a stealer. We just accidentally ship them when we, upload something to our Git repos, which happens within a matter of minutes to hours after that happens. So this prevalence of stealers is really enabling this account compromise like we talked about. They're always going to be targeting these accounts because of the level of access. Misconfigurations overwhelmingly are something that we need to keep an eye out for. With something like hundreds of thousands of different permissions that you can apply to any given account, it's almost impossible for sysadmins and everyone else who's trying to defend these accounts to prevent misconfigurations wholeheartedly. It's not going to happen. So we need to be able to detect when identities move outside of their, typical path to then detect anomalous behavior and then hopefully catch that activity before it gets to the impact stage. And then, like we talked about before, as companies and we all move towards leveraging SSO, single sign-on, adversaries are moving there as well. Access keys are just as important to protect as any given password. They provide the same level of access. They can also provide long-lived access. Primary refresh tokens, which is the thing that you use to then gain access keys on a regular interval, can persist for upwards of 90 days. So if an adversary gains access to those refresh tokens, they can then persist in the environment for a very, very long time until that account is revoked or that access is revoked, which I'll talk about towards the end when we talk about our recommendations. So next slide. Email forwarding and hiding rules. This abuse vector is typically an adversary is gaining access to an email inbox. They are then using inbox rules to move or delete emails. And the reason that they're doing this, one, it could be for financial theft. So if you have, say, an HR software, which a lot of us do, then what they might do is set up a forwarding rule or a deletion rule that will automatically delete or forward those emails to an inbox so the victim can't see it. The reason they do this is because then they gain access to the HR software and they change something like the direct deposit for that employee. And then now the employee has no idea that their paycheck is no longer being given to them. It's now being given to the adversary. So that's one example of something they might use for financial gain. They're typically using different folders that have common names. So it could be junk, could be spam, things that you don't necessarily check on any given day and fly under the radar so you don't log into your email and see that there's, obviously suspicious folder that you don't want to look at. They're going to be trying to hide it. The other thing that they're trying to do is going to be data exfiltration. So an example of that is the compromise at the State Department that happened a few months back, where adversaries were just collecting information that comes through these inboxes. Email is always going to be a great place to gather information and to perform activity. So this is always probably going to be one of the top techniques that we're going to talk about in the following years, and something that we keep liking to push to the left on the compromise because it's starting to emerge as a very common pattern of activity for these types of abuse. And that's exactly what the adversaries do. They're putting it in there so you didn't see anything that happened. Don't worry about it. So cloud service hijacking, this one's the technique highlight, just because it's pretty interesting. So spam and smishing campaigns continue to leverage cloud resources. It's a perfect opportunity for adversaries to gain access to these cloud resources and then just send out thousands, millions, all sorts of different spam campaigns, text message campaigns, all sorts of things. That's been happening for a while. One of the new things is the cloud-hosted LLM services. So I mentioned Bedrock. Azure OpenAPI is another one. These services grant you access to either third-party LLMs or could be hosted internally to AWS or Azure. Bedrock is a good example of kind of this marketplace of LLMs that you can have access to. Now, adversaries, what they do is, first step is obtain the credentials, obviously log in with the identity. They run the reconnaissance commands. So in AWS, this can be list models. The interesting thing about Bedrock is you have to explicitly ask for access to an LLM. And so what adversaries will do is actually do that request. And then a lot of the times, if they have permissions, we'll automatically approve it. So you'll see someone request something and then it'll be approved and you'll have no idea that it necessarily happened. And then once they get that access, then they're going to start selling the keys to that LLM on the back end. So that way they can provide content for end users, and then they're going to gain financial means off of it because they're selling that access.
Yeah, and there's an interesting report that Microsoft put out, I think like maybe a couple of weeks ago now, about how they were suing some organization for hijacking their LLMs and using them to spread some variety of content, probably illicit content. So
Yep.
go and Google that. It's a pretty interesting read.
Yeah, there's also a couple great posts by Framiso, who is some of the ones that, broke a lot of this technique. So they have a great example of all of the stuff that they're selling on the back end for those illicit means. The other interesting thing is adversaries were leveraging like reverse proxies. So they were actually granting themselves like a high availability model for access to these LLMs. So they could farm several keys for access and then use those to make sure that they don't have any service interruptions for their end users. So we're seeing, like we talked about before with some of these stealers, like it is a full service that they're offering, the same way that you might with legitimate software. So recommendations, what we really like to see is context, which is why I wrote it 3 times on the screen. So we want context around the behavior of an identity. This means that we want to be able to figure out, is this normal for this identity? This can be extremely challenging in the cloud, especially because you have identities sharing account access and all sorts of other things, automated accounts, cross domains, like all sorts of places that you want to find this activity. So it can be extremely challenging to find if this behavior is actually malicious or anomalous or not. We always like to provide analysts as much as we can with contextual information about the history of access So is this API command something they run all the time? Is it not? And that's something that we are starting to leverage generative AI for. We're seeing identity pages where it says, this identity has logged in from this IP address this percentage of the time over the last 30 days. That's something we're really trying to improve upon for our analysts. And then context around the identity's access level. This is more of the like, do they have the authority to do these things? So looking at the service control policies, resource control policies, all those sorts of things, and figuring out, is this something that they should normally have access to? So this could be an example of an adversary manipulating the account to grant themselves administrative control. It's pretty easy to identify some of the built-in administrative access control policies. The challenge is when you start renaming those policies and then apply it so that way you can't really do these IOC or these name detections on these sorts of things. This also allows us to determine the severity of the compromise. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And then the last thing is the context of the control policies. So you want to know which policies apply to which identities, so that way you can remediate when something happens. I have a few blog posts about the source identity field in AWS. Highly recommend you implement that if you're on AWS. It allows you to not only remediate, but it also allows you to remediate per identity rather than account. So that way you don't lose any business access for when something happens. And next slide.
All right, back to me. I will say we did just get a question about if we have any thoughts on the Oracle breach in quotation marks. And the answer is not really at this time. We sent a bulletin out to customers. We're aware of it. We're tracking it. Sorry, my camera keeps pausing, as you can see. We're back. So the passwords, SSO and LDAP passwords were allegedly encrypted. Oracle said it didn't happen. So we're kind of waiting to see what else comes out about it. Sorry for the non-answer there. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about ransomware. As we said at the front end, like ransomware is still a problem, still something that people very much should be concerned about. And it's still very, very lucrative for bad guys. So like aggregate payouts for ransomware events are allegedly up on an individualized basis. They're allegedly, I should say reportedly, they are also reportedly up. So, right, prices are going up. People are still paying them. Now, we almost exclusively see early stage ransomware, right? So we have this little vertical ransomware attack chain here split into two parts, right? The pre-ransomware part, which is your initial access, your lateral movement, your reconnaissance. And then we also have sort of the business end of a ransomware event, which is where data is getting exfiltrated and encryption is happening. So, and Jesse alluded to this in the context of cloud accounts too. We try to focus our effort on catching these things early, because once you start catching the exfiltration and encryption parts, it's probably too late and you're already in an incident. So detecting
Yeah.
ransomware precursors. What were you gonna say, Jesse?
I was going to say, like for an example, there was a few posts recently about ransomware in AWS. And I did some testing, and it takes about 5 to 6 minutes for the logs to even show up in CloudTrail. So before that activity happens, the adversary has about 5 to 6 minutes to start encrypting stuff before you even get the first precursor that it's happening.
Yeah. So on endpoints, like again, someone in the chat was talking about the disparity. We were talking about the disparity between like how fast things move on an endpoint versus how fast things move in the cloud. I do think you have a little bit more time on an endpoint, because typically, like, you've got to get the initial access for whatever the dropper is that's going to lead to that ransomware payload. So if you get really, really good at detecting the things that deliver ransomware, and I'll show you the top things on the next slide, then you can get really good at just stopping ransomware, or at least going a long way towards stopping or mitigating the risk of ransomware. So again, we don't see a ton of ransomware, but based on our sort of analysis on the precursors that we saw, Akira, Play, Fog, Lockbit, Ransom Hub, and Black Basta were the ones that we think were probably could have been most prevalent across our customers had there not been intervention early in that ransomware process. This list might look different if you're an incident response provider where you're coming in on the back end where the bad things already happened and you've got that full attack life cycle. But these are the ones that we think were pretty prevalent this year. So let's talk about ransomware precursors. Six of our top 10 threats could lead to ransomware. Now, we're not saying every time that Impact or Mimikatz shows up, you're going to have a ransomware event, but they are used in the service of ransomware by adversaries. So among these precursors, we've got droppers, we've got remote management and monitoring tools like NetSupport Manager, and we've got testing tools like Impacket and Mimikatz. So getting good at detecting these things and responding to them quickly, isolating endpoints, that is a really, really strong strategy for preventing encryption and extortion, right? These incidents can move pretty quickly once they start to happen. So you do want to move really, really quickly. Maybe not that 5 to 7 minute lag, that critical 5 to 7 minute lag that Jesse's talking about, but we are talking about, minutes and hours here. So a couple of shout outs to call out here. One is our open source baselining tool, Surveyor. You can use that with a supported EDR platform to look for the presence of unsanctioned RMN tools in your environment and a wide variety of other tools. And then a shout out to this open and notepad concept. Like a lot of payloads out there right now are delivering things like JS files. And if those things automatically open in WScript, like that's a problem. So you can use GPOs to set it so that they open automatically in Notepad. They don't execute anything. Normal users like, I don't know what this is, and they move on. And people who need to use JavaScript for whatever reason, they can figure out how to open that manually. So here's like kind of an example of what one of these ransomware intrusion chains might look like. And we've got kind of markings on here for detection and mitigation opportunities as the case may be. So on the initial access part, sometimes we see like public facing infrastructure or applications getting compromised through a variety of means. We have access brokers that can deliver these threats via remote monitoring and management tools or remote access tools. We also see open remote desktop ports, sometimes ones that are either like unprotected or protected with weak passwords, I guess. Sometimes those get abused. And then from there, an adversary might go into sort of credential access land. They might use they might use Mimikatz to get credentials. They might dump the contents of LSASS. They can also dump Active Directory. They might target domain or enterprise admins to elevate their access levels. And then we see lateral movement all the time in ransomware attacks. So whether it's through a tool like PsExec or one of the many other ways that you can sort of talk between computers in a modern enterprise network. We see a lot of WMI, again, remote desktop protocol stuff as well. And then again, on the business end of this is where we start to see backups and shadow copies getting deleted and then data being encrypted for impact. And you absolutely, absolutely do not want to wait for this phase to start acting on ransomware. Like once backups are getting deleted, you're already in trouble. All right, so a screen full of text. You're welcome. Some stuff to keep in mind, like some more specific ransomware advice. We'll get to sort of more generic stuff on the next slide. Education, like one thing that we didn't really talk about specifically here is some tradecraft that we saw throughout the year where Black Basta ransomware affiliates were using social engineering. So they basically will flood an email account with spam, and then they'll send in inbound chat requests through Microsoft Teams to say like, hey, we're the IT department, we're with the help desk, like we can help solve this this email flooding or this spam problem you're running into. Just install this software. And it might be something like NetSupport Manager that they then can use to take control of a device and move on throughout their objectives. So disallowing external access on things like Microsoft Teams so that you either have allow listed domains with partners or you only allow internal connections on Microsoft Teams is a good way to sort of head off this problem. Also, like put detection and response and tooling and EDR and visibility tools everywhere. We often see incidents, like particularly when we come in on the back end of an incident response, like it turns out like some unmonitored system or endpoint was the starting point for this compromise. And then like maintain allow lists for RMM tools and deny the use of other ones. Like there should only be the ones that you're allowed to use, and you should keep a close eye on them because adversaries do love using those tools because they look legitimate and they work really, really well. And they even will masquerade them, change the file names for them. So you have to be able to compare presented file names with internal metadata and binary metadata that reveals the actual identity of these tools. So more generally, like try to keep your head wrapped around the surface area that you're exposing. Like think about what public facing applications you have, whether they need to be, try and limit that as much as humanly possible. Obviously, apply updates as frequently and as quickly as possible, especially ones that show up in like that CISA known exploited vulnerability database. And then everyone should have a robust response and recovery plan that they practice so that you know when the bad thing happens, you can actually respond to it, restore from backup. You know who to talk to, who to reach out to, whether or not you need to get a lawyer involved, whether or not you need to call an IR firm, and so on and so forth. So I think that's everything. We actually made it in under time. I am now going to see if there's any questions that have come in. I think we did a pretty good job answering most of the questions that came in. I will ask, I don't know if we have an answer to this, but Brian in the chat asked if we're still seeing SMB as a deployment channel for like, I would think he's asking like for ransomware, but for lateral movement in particular. Does anyone know off the top of their head if we're still seeing a lot of SMB activity?
No, I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go check.
I mean, we still see like WannaMine, but I don't know if that's still using like the same SMB stuff that it was all using like years and years ago. We'd have to go and look into that. I don't know if anyone's completely blocked RMM tools outside of your company's supported VPN. That would be an interesting question to get answers from the folks in the chat on. And I think that is pretty much everything. Someone asked at some point if this recording will be sent to you. It will be made available. It will be on our website. It will probably be emailed to you after the fact. Big thank you to everyone for joining us. I'd encourage everyone to go check out the threat detection report. There's an executive summary that's relatively short. You can start there. There's a PDF version that's slightly abridged. It's still kind of long, but it's not the exhaustive report. And then there's the web-based version of the report, which is where you're going to find all of the really, really detailed guidance on sort of like actual pseudo detectors that we've built to try and catch this stuff. Atomic red team tests you can use if you try to implement our pseudo detectors to exercise those detectors and stuff like that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Alex and Jesse, for joining me today. I hope everyone found this super useful, and thank you all for coming.
Have a good one.